Welcome to Groundwater Rising. This podcast is all about flooding, and in particular, as the title suggests, we focus on one of the most overlooked and misunderstood types. It's groundwater flooding. Historically, it's the least monitored, it's the least talked about, and it's quite often the last thing on the list when discussing flood risk. And it is that lack of understanding that can leave communities confused, unprepared, and often unheard. I'm Helen from Project Groundwater, and I'll be speaking to community members who live with groundwater flooding, alongside researchers, engineers, practitioners who are working to understand it better and to help reduce its impact. But I'm not here as a technical expert. I'm here to ask those questions that people outside the sector might be too embarrassed to ask or just don't have that opportunity. The what does that actually mean questions and why does it matter to me ones. Together we'll explore real experiences, emerging research and the practical thinking from the water sector, academia and beyond to help make groundwater flooding something people can understand, talk about and plan for. And today I'm joined by Claude Nsobya, whose PhD explores the relationship between community resilience and community involvement in flood risk management. Claude earned his MSc in Environmental Change and Management from the University of Oxford in the UK after his BSc in Environmental Studies from Makerere University in Uganda.
Thank you, Helen, for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Let's just kick off, shall we, with your journey into this. I mean, it didn't start with flooding, from what I understand. It actually started with drought in your home village in Uganda. Is that right? Can you tell me a bit more about it?
So, as you rightly stated, I did my bachelor's, my BSc in Environmental Sciences in Makerere University in Uganda, in Kampala. And around my second year, I was having a chat with my dad's sister, who was financially helping my family, given that I lost my dad when I was really young. And she told me that her farm was starting to experience lots of chaya. We call it chaya in Uganda, which are droughts, increasing in frequency, affecting our produce, obviously, and the income as well. So I was really intrigued. My second year, and that was the time where we were supposed to decide what we are going to research in. So I was like, okay, let me come and see what's going on. So my first piece of research was in my home village in Uganda, central Uganda, Luweero, Nakaseta, and a few neighboring villages. So that the development of theory as well as the research for drought risk management, adaptation. I did well in my bachelor's. Then I joined this sort of graduate program with the Ministry of Water and Environment after the bachelor's. So it was a one-year graduate program, and I was attached to the Ministry of Water Department, Water for Production, which deals at irrigation schemes, water reservoirs for dealing with drought. So again, I get experience with government projects, small-scale irrigation schemes. So after that 1 year, that's when I joined the University of Oxford. But again, I do my research in drought because I was very much a drought person because of that personal interest. I come back to Uganda for my research when I was at Oxford. This time I do it in Western Uganda. As I'm working in these drought risk management projects, I'm introduced to nature-based solutions. So in Uganda, there are some projects that tend to look at the integrated nature of droughts and floods. For example, if you look at nature-based solutions, they help with both flooding and droughts. Hence my love for nature-based solutions. So that's how I landed on a certain project. By then it was called GRACE. I don't know if you're aware of that, Helen. Before Project Groundwater became Project Groundwater, it was called GRACE. Groundwater Resilience and Community Engagement, GRACE.
And when you started out, did you have a plan?
So in the first year for the PhD, you do lots of literature reviews, so trying to find out what's out there. And quickly, you find out that there's very little when it comes to groundwater flooding. And obviously, the project was the first of its kind in England. In my first year, I lobbied to have this sort of comparison between Uganda and England. When it comes to resilience, context matters. Also, when you talk about engagement, context matters because communities are different. I thought it would be interesting to compare and see what's going on in these two unique, different contexts.
Back to then working on Project Groundwater, you developed a resilience framework?
So resilience, I'll start with the definition of resilience, the one I use. So one, it is to resist floods, to absorb and recover or respond to floods, or to adapt, plan and change. So in other words, it is stopping floods, withstanding, or learning and changing. And the interesting thing is that the term resilience, for example, in my study, or in Uganda, does not have a direct local dialect. So I had to break it down, definitely, to these communities for them to understand what I'm talking about. So I had to break it down into those things. So what helps you, for example, to stop floods, what helps you to withstand floods, what helps you to learn from, to adapt to floods. So I guess that is the simplest way you can talk about resilience in practice.
Which is a really useful thing, because it becomes a buzzword, doesn't it? It becomes, everyone talks about resilience, even, not in the flood and climate world. We talk to our children about being resilient, and do they really know what it means? Probably not. We have to break things down, and you have to make it personal, don't you? Otherwise, it just becomes a term that gets glossed over.
I agree. So to understand resilience, I had to develop a sort of framework, which is looking at 6 resources, basically, that communities can draw upon in order to better stop floods, better manage floods, better withstand floods. So things like maybe local knowledge, ownership, skills, any skills that can help you to stop floods, any sort of awareness, basically. Awareness is a major one. Then when it comes to the social capacity, it's more to do with the networks or the relationships between communities or between community and government. Then when it comes to the economic capacity, that one is a bit more straightforward. These are the funds available to communities to manage floods. Institutional capacity is more with the governance, government leadership, government funding, for example, for DEFRA or for Buckinghamshire Council to manage floods. Then we have the natural and the physical. The natural, again, that is the nature-based solutions, tree planting, wetland restoration. Physical is more of the infrastructure that helps, for example, the flood walls, flood dikes, or property flood resilience, more on the small scale. So I looked at all those sort of resources and I mapped them across these 2 case studies in Uganda and in England.
What are the things that really stood out from that process and the comparison?
In Uganda focused a lot on nature-based solutions. So it was wetland restoration, tree planting, riverbank restoration. There was an aspect of the economic capacity. But before every intervention that was done, it was first skilling the community members in terms of how they will do it, raising their awareness, why it is important, and also how they would own it beyond the project. And if you look at that, that is like putting the human capacity before the natural capacity, before the economic capacity, because it was important for the communities to own these interventions after the project. And then if you look at how the interventions were managed, it was done by the community groups themselves. So there were water and environment cooperatives. So these cooperatives were made up of community members that were involved or that were based in these catchment. So the catchment was broken down into 3: Upper, Middle, and Lower Maziba. So in each of these sub-catchments, they developed community groups or water and environment cooperatives that would manage the wetland restoration, but also, as well as after the wetland restoration, monitor the buffer zones that have been made. And they were also in charge of the resources. So resources were given to these sub-catchments and they were in charge of managing them to the smaller groups. So the community groups were fundamental. Also, they allowed collective action for the individuality of this ownership to more collective resource. When these individuals saw that it is a collective, they even got stronger. So when it comes to the capacities, I saw that the human and the social helped these other natural or the economic capacity increase their viability or increase their efficiency, I would say. Then in terms of the physical or the infrastructure, it was done in a unique way to support learning. For example, a dike, it was a sort of demonstration center, so where communities can come to learn how to control erosion on their farms, how to plant, do agroforestry. The infrastructure was used as a basis for learning in order to undertake further nature-based solutions. So when it comes to the institution played more of a supportive role. The sort of monitoring, the sort of continuous advice, also continuous resources. So now some of these cooperatives have administrative blocks and the things like stationery, things like computers. Again, that sort of continuous support from government is very fundamental. You do not leave these communities on their own after the project is done. Just continuously support them. It also helps the government department because it helps them know what is happening, any changes or any risks that they may not have seen. So it's that two-way dialogue that is important in terms of the sustainability of these interventions.
What were the main differences from, as much as you could understand, with that community engagement in terms of people's attitudes, people's preparedness to actually get involved? You say context is everything. It absolutely is. No, not everybody is affected by flooding directly or believes they are or believes they have a role to play in it either.
If I talk about England, Project Groundwater, they had the intention of starting with communities from the get-go, because even the title, the advertisement was towards crop production with grace. Early on, 2021, they tried to have many community partners on board, but by the time they tried to have the early engagement exercises, they hadn't brought on board the Groundwork South. They hadn't brought on board the Aurora engagements. So the expertise in engagement was challenging. But the challenge was, again, because of the sort of institutional capacity, awarding contracts at times takes long because of the sort of rigid measures that are there to curb any sort of loopholes. So it took long for the project to get these experts on board. But again, England was also quite different. For example, Chalfont St. Peter is different from South Oxford. Pang Valley is different from Luton. In Uganda, at least in the catchment, they're mostly farmers, basically. But in England, in Buckinghamshire, the communities, they're very different. So I guess that was, again, an inherent challenge for the project. And if you had to compare these two projects, this is very vastly different, the communities, whereas in Uganda, they were not that much different.
The difference within those communities, even, as you say, from Pang to Chafford, do you think those differences are because of the landscape? It's trying to work out, they're not too far apart. And yet the differences are there. So it must be something to do with their relationship to the land around them.
Yes, that's also came out in my research. Basically, for example, in Luton, you would find that there's a high level of transient community. People do not necessarily plan to be there for a while. Compared to Pang Valley, where people are expected to be there for generations. So we saw those differences in that there was a lot of will in Pang Valley compared to the challenges in Luton. So those differences do play a part. If you try to approach engagement the same way in this context, then you are really set up for failure. When I was looking at the relationship between engagement and resilience, what influences this engagement from the go is the existing resilience or the existing contextual factors. So for example, the existing resources or the existing social networks, past experiences, bad or good. Without understanding that existing resilience, to support engagement or to influence engagement, you cannot get the full picture when you look at only how engagement supposed to be. So that was a major key finding. Understand where communities are and work from there. Don't start with the high level, okay, we shall do this in this community, we shall do this. It's about understanding where communities are and then you work from there.
As you say, that transient nature, if people are there, especially Luton, a lot of them are commuting, they're there for work, they're moving on, they're moving out, and yet you've got those established families. And I don't know about Uganda, but I would assume that there's a lot more families that stay where they are, farming the land, so the land is their utmost concern. Whereas, you've got somebody in a block of flats in Luton does not have that connection to the land around them.
Most of the interventions that were done also had the benefit for agriculture. So, for example, when you look at agroforestry, tree planting, the soil and water conservation mechanisms, the terracing, all those interventions help with controlling erosion, hence downstream flooding, but also they help with agriculture. That's why communities were very, very engaged, because they also had added benefit. And motivation is a key important. If you want to get community ownership, someone has to understand how are they benefiting. In research, there is an author called Lindsay McCowen. She found out how some community members get engaged in community flood groups for the social aspect of it, and not necessarily to do with flooding, but the motivation is something else.
So tell us more then about your findings in terms of the community affecting resilience. There must be so much that you're bubbling to say.
In terms of the relationship between community engagement and community resilience, existing contextual factors support engagement. To understand how that engagement will support resilience. If you look at only half the picture, you miss why this engagement may fail or why it may succeed. Then I found out that engagement relates to resilience in mainly 2 to 3 ways. One is you develop ownership. It can be through development of skills or awareness. Then it also develops relationships. These can be relationships within communities, but also between community and government. Then we saw that the relationship between engagement and resilience is not linear, or it is not straightforward. I had a framework which was looking at what effective engagement looks like. So I had things like inclusive engagement. I had things like early and long-term involvement. So I had things like two-way dialogue, clarity of roles. And I found out that even early engagement, if not done right, can affect the relationship building, or it can affect ownership development. For example, Project Groundwater had motivation to have early engagement, but because of those challenges of the institutional rigidity and then the delaying of getting the contracts for these engagement teams, and it ended up affecting. Involving them early enough ended up making them less interested in the project in a twisted way. So it is about getting that early engagement right. How are you doing this is what matters. And I think that message is important for resilience, for the flood risk management, yes.
You're building trust right from the beginning, aren't you? If those little cues are off and that trust doesn't feel like it's being built, you lose people.
In England, some of the interventions, although it was to manage expectations, but I think it's about finding a balance between managing expectations and then not limiting how much community can provide input without communities losing that sort of ownership. All in all, I found out that engagement supports resilience, but the nature of that engagement is what determines if it influences it positively or negatively, because it's about understanding what exactly is being done and obviously how that existing resilience supports that engagement.
So a lot of what we're doing all the time is learning. We're learning what works, what doesn't work. There are a lot of factors that you can't control. So a lot of what you're saying is, it's fine, it's good, it's great, but the balance has to be right.
I don't think you can know what the balance is. I think it's about learning. One of my key recommendations is that early and long-term involvement of communities or engaging with the communities is fundamental attribute, because when you take communities on a journey, then you are most likely to be inclusive. And we saw that with Project Groundwater. They got better at engaging with Luton. It's about having enough resources to have a long-term journey with these communities. Starting out from the front and saying, okay, that I will have this balance right from the start is very difficult. Have enough ring-fenced budgets. Let engagement be its own deliverable with KPIs that are being followed. And at times it's about negotiations, about trade-offs, it's about, yes, but you can only do that after learning what the communities are.
With Project Groundwater, with all of the flood and coastal resilience programmes that are ongoing and coming to an end in the beginning of 2027, capturing that learning, exactly what you're doing. You're making sure that people can understand and learn from your findings. The live projects, everything that's being done, if we're capturing that information, it can only help for the next project. Those communities that we're engaging, they're doing the same job. They're learning. They're teaching other people within their communities. So is there a role, do you think, for actually taking that expertise and trying to transfer those communities elsewhere, trying to get them to teach other communities, trying to sort of share that knowledge from that side as well?
That is one of the things that your podcast is doing, I think, because you hold communities who share their stories, and I'm sure different communities listen to these stories and they get on board. So awareness is one of the most important things that I think this project is doing when it comes to groundwater flooding. It is laying the baseline, because little is known about groundwater flooding. What this project is doing, there's this Darcy's Tale, the whole YouTube animation that the project did that will stay beyond the project, and the things they're sharing in the podcast. Then I think the project's legacy discussions are also important. All that learning has to be shared. I was talking to, I think, a community member in Pang Valley, I think parish councillor, and she told me that what she's liking from this project is that they're getting a database of flooding types, and that will be used for future. And obviously, when it comes to academia, when we publish some of these findings, these things will stay and hopefully they will be cited, and this is the baseline.
What is it that you think we've learned the most from? What's been the biggest learning? Maybe something that didn't quite go to plan that we should have done differently? What is it that's really stuck out for you from that perspective? Trusting
communities more. I think the project has learned working with existing community groups. I'll give the example. Quickly, the project found out that the sort of voluntary resource is getting finite in England, especially after COVID. So instead of forming new groups, the project has learned now to work with existing ones and then expanding their base to include. And I think that's why the traction has increased. Trusting their local knowledge, trusting their local networks and working with them. I think that is one big lesson I think that this project has learned. 2, I think last year, Buckinghamshire Council introduced a sort of flood liaison officer role. This officer role will work directly with these community flood action groups. That is learning, because they are basically saying that we need constant networks between government and community. So in terms of the work you've put in to date, you've completed your PhD, it's due to be published at some point this year. What is it that you want to happen? How do you want that learning and that understanding to impact other people? I think from a community side of things, I'll start with the community, then I'll go to the government. When it comes to resilience, it is about understanding the things that can be done? What things do you have control? Because there was the rhetoric that not a lot can be done about groundwater flooding, which is true to an extent, but I wouldn't necessarily agree with it 100% because there are things like having a flood plan. Just a simple flood plan doesn't require a lot. Just knowing where to put the things in case of a flood, maybe taking them upstairs, maybe what to switch off, the simple basics. Just having that increases your resilience tremendously because you are ready. That doesn't need necessarily a lot of resources. Things like signing up to warning systems, again, that doesn't require a lot. So there's some things that can be done. Also, even getting engaged in tree planting in your community, knowing which community flood action group, if any, is available. Just that sort of building your own awareness and your own ownership. I think those are things that don't require a lot of resources. So that's something that can be done. Fundamentally important for groundwater flooding because of its unique nature. It takes forever. You don't see it coming. So that's what makes groundwater a bit different. Then when it comes to government, policymakers, I have a few recommendations. One that I've not really talked about in this podcast is policy. In England, Flood and Water Management Act, and that how interacts with groundwater flooding. Because if you look at the Flood and Water Management Act of 2010, the way it came up, it was after the 2007 summer floods, hence the pit review in 2008. It was sort of reactive to those freshwater floods that destroyed lots of property and a few people died. You can see it in terms of groundwater flooding. If you look at the responsibility that's given to obviously the lead local flood authorities like Buckinghamshire Council, but again, they're not supposed to have operational input. They're not supposed to do anything to the water until it pops out. So the clarity is missing, and talking to experts, they say that everyone keeps on shifting responsibility. That is a challenge that has to be fixed. It has to be clear who's responsible, what can be done. And the thing is, the strategy of 2020 agency strategy, they didn't understand it. But now I think with Project Groundwater, that understanding has definitely improved with this flood warning system, the novel flood warning system that has been introduced. I think that has to be clarified to avoid being reactive. I think that has to be done. Then the networks between community and government, those are important for sustainability, to understand what's going on in the project, but also for the communities to get this consistent support from government, building on this flood liaison officer role, obviously. Yeah, and I think the project, for example, Buckinghamshire Council and DEFRA will get that message right when these things published, when we have conferences at Flood and Coast or policy briefs. I think these messages will be pushed, and we hope that DEFRA, the EA, carry them on.
That's the funny thing, isn't it? It is the least researched, which is why you found it quite an interesting area to dig into. And you're now helping plug that gap. And Project Groundwater is helping plug that gap. So when the plan was created in 2020, there wasn't much knowledge about it. There's more knowledge. It's building. And it's building not just in Buckinghamshire. Obviously, we have these projects across the country. And whilst it's not all groundwater, there's a building knowledge about flood and flood resilience that is driving towards this change. So your work in that has been so invaluable. Thank you so much for spending time with me today, Claude. Managing to get this time in your diary is difficult. You're a very busy man, and I really do appreciate the time that you've given us, so thank you.
Thank you, Helen.
And a big thank you to everyone who's listening as well. Don't forget, if you like what you've heard, remember you can subscribe, leave a review, but also it's so important that we are getting these stories out there, so share with people that you think might be interested to hear more. And if you've got a topic that you want to know more about or you want to discuss with me directly, then do email me. You can join me and talk about your personal experiences. So you can email Groundwater Rising at projectgroundwater.co.uk. And in the meantime, we'll be back next month.